Hi there, folks. I am continuing my series about how to address some of the problems in our politics and culture. In the video where I talked about like what's the problem with the world, part of what I pointed out is that we are getting ourselves into a good guys versus bad guys kind of debate, and we're treating it as though we are somehow fixed in these states of good and bad. Um, and I also, in the first of this series, I talked about how one of the ways that we can start dealing with that is starting to have compassion and forgiveness for ourselves. And that will open up our capacity for compassion and forgiveness for one another. Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's so important. And I'm going to do that by breaking down a little bit about how I understand the political worldviews here. And I want to give a little hat tip to Steve McIntosh, who is a person who I learned about this from. But I'm going to try to break it down in a way that makes sense and hopefully can point to ways that we can start interacting with each other that can really make a better, bigger, make a difference, especially as we go into some of the complicated times that are going to be coming up before, during, and after this election season. So, first of all, I want to say I consider myself to be a post-progressive. And that sounds like a pretty elitist term or some sort of far out thing, but hopefully by the end of this, it's going to make sense. Um, Part of my philosophy, this T-shirt here is from the Andrew Yang campaign, and it really means a lot to me. Not left, not right, but forward. So how do we do that? Well, so first thing I want to say is that the main thing that is going to be important is for each of us to start noticing and be willing to acknowledge, like, what is the shadow of our own perspective, and be willing to notice that we don't actually have all the answers, and be willing to admit to the mistakes or the risks of our own political worldview. And the other piece is to talk about how can we actually understand and lift up what is positive about the worldviews or political beliefs of others. And part of the way that works is just recognizing that we all have something that's positive and we all have a shadow to the way we think about things. Now, we tend to look at politics in this sort of like left right sort of perspective, and that goes all the way back to the French Revolution. And I'm not going to get too much into the history of it, but basically it's this kind of idea of like, do we do things the old way or we do things the new way? I think that our current politics, especially the United States, but I think probably around the world, is actually more complex than that. I sort of noticed that we have basically three political worldviews that are playing out in this world. And I've started to make a little thing here. And basically, these three political worldviews are traditional, modern, and progressive. Now, a traditional worldview is basically saying that has a lot of like patriotism and like what is the way things that worked before, and let's keep on doing them that way, right? Modernism was sort of what birthed the United States. That's basically science and democracy and the idea that we're all equal and sort of lifting up that. There's a lot of institutions and rule of law that are sort of born out of a modern perspective. And progressivism is something that we were was born in the 60s, and progressive worldview is basically saying that like we got to make a world for everyone and we got to take care of the environment and so forth. Now, each of these are sort of born out of the other, and we can see these three political parties or three political worldviews sort of playing out in the world. Now, you might be trying to think like, well, how does this fit into like Republican or Democrat? You can imagine that modern is sort of like the main core of our politics. When people talk about compromise or let's go to the middle, or people talk about the liberal consensus, this is the main center of everything. And then, and it's also the sort of the institutions that sort of hold everything together. There's like the Constitution, police, government, and all these things. Now, when people are talking about a traditional worldview, is basically like what are the sort of values and these can be religious or country or cultural values that sort of are the foundation that this country was built on, and so forth. And the progressive one is sort of like a political worldview that is basically saying, like, um, uh, wow, we're going to have to really grow and change and evolve and so forth. Now, the thing is each of these have positive qualities and negative qualities. I'm not sure if you all can see this, but basically, what we have going on here is so the traditional worldview is basically like really powerful and like the roots and pride and country and just like the traditional values that got us here in the first place, right? Now, the shadow side of that is if we try to go back to the way things started, then there's a way that that starts lifting up either the supremacy of white guys being in charge, religion. Um, uh, Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate that, Mike. Suggestion here. Talk about religion and the shadow of this is that if we're like focusing on how great this country is, or if we even go to the extreme of saying the United States is like the greatest country, then the problem becomes that we sort of can get racism or xenophobia and a certain kind of elitism or sort of power of like this has got to be the way things are. Now, modernism is pretty amazing. It's part of what gives us the structure for things to sort of work in this world. And so this gives us like institutions, and it also gives us science and like rational thinking and equality and all those kinds of things. But there's a way that there's a certain lack of, values in that sort of system. And so this also, leads to some of the dangers of capitalism and economics. And so you get like environmental destruction. You get environmental destruction and you get bureaucracy and sort of dehumanization. Now, progressivism then also points out this idea that like we can also have like we're going to build a world for everyone. We want all religions, all peoples, all genders, all races. So there's a certain space for all that equity and it's all people, and we also start caring about the planet, and that's like really amazing. But there is yeah the planet, and then Jordan, I'll answer your question in just a second. And the but there's like a certain riskiness because one of the shadows of this is it kind of creates a sort of anti-patriotism and it also is very risky because if we like go progressively into the future, then we then we're actually can be uprooting ourselves from the past. So yeah, so Jordan asked here like that modernism is a certain way the tradition of the United States. So the United States, sort of born out of the Enlightenment, was definitely something that definitely is sort of the origins of this country. But what I sort of pointing out to about traditionalism is this idea that of sort of religious traditionalism, sort of like those kinds of like religious values, and yeah, and so what kind of happens is like what the reason why I think that what becomes really interesting here is that the traditional worldview and the progressive worldview are both values based worldviews. And so they're basically saying, like, this is how we should be doing things. Well, modernism is what's giving the structure for that values based debate to be happening. And so you have these two groups sort of like kind of attacking modernism, sort of either when Trump is talking about draining the swamp, or the left is talking about resisting capitalism or abolishing the police or something like that. That basically they're basically criticizing the system, but it's actually the system that's giving them place to have this values based debate. So there's kind of two ways out of this path, and this is what I kind of really want to focus on. So the way that I sort of take my own political worldview is something that I call post-progressivism. And again, actually, Steve McIntosh sort of calls that. Um, uh, Post-progressivism. I've also heard it called meta-modernism. People also call it turquoise, or people call it like an integral political perspective. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. And basically, it's a political worldview to basically say, hey, you know what? I really celebrate all of these. I really think that it's really important for us to really understand the cultural values that sort of like laid the foundations for this country. That I also really appreciate the institutions and the systems and science and rational beliefs and all these things. This is like really important. And I want to make sure that we build a world for all people and all the planet, and we liberate ourselves into creative ways of being, and we have a bright future, and we keep building towards that. But what's also really useful, and this is, I think, that could be something that's really powerful, is that for each group to recognize wherever you find yourself on this map, like recognize that you also have a shadow, and that these other sides also have sort of positive values. And like, how can you enter into a conversation, whether you're progressive or conservative? Can you say, hey, you know what? I understand. Like, how can you begin to address some of the shadow sides of one of your things? And so part of what can happen here is, like, for the far right to really within itself start trying to address the ways that racism comes up as they're trying to sort of quote like make America great again. And how can the far left be able to basically address the issues of anti-Americanism or anti-patriotism that arise, or even just like the risky sort of undermining of the things that got us here. I know a perspective, someone I know closely, for example, is very concerned about this new generation getting rid of the traditional family by creating like poly relationships and like gay relationships and all these different things, and like, well, what's going to happen? And this feels risky, and like, can we admit that this is risky? We're trying the new things. But there's also positive aspects. And the modernist perspective, this sort of core of the country, like, we need to be really careful about making sure that we are clean. We're still caring for the environment. We're still caring to like not be too caught up in institutions, while also, pointing out that the institutions are important. And so, anyways, I hope this is making sense. I guess the thing I really just want to emphasize here is that, like, our political conversations are going to improve immensely if we're able to kind of take responsibility for our own group and be willing to say, you know what, like, I know that this is not like the way that I'm approaching things isn't always the best or isn't always the safest. And I really want to make sure that I don't have some of the negative impacts that my political perspective has. And then also for us to be able to sort of lift up those worldviews of each other, um, and really recognize, like, hey, you know what? I really see what's really good about the way that you're seeing things. Um, and if we're able to have that kind of conversation where we can say, I understand the risks to my perspective, and I understand what's really great about your perspective, and I have concerns about your perspective, and I want to propose this, because that the way to be able to get there, and again, this is kind of back to the previous video, is like that's what helps us have like that level of compassion for ourselves, and to know that we aren't perfect, will help us look at each other and recognize that each other aren't perfect, but that really everyone is trying to bring forward something that's positive in this world. And honestly, we're going to need all of these to really be able to move things forward. We really do need to remember that this is an amazing fucking country. Like, it was really powerful. Like, we've done amazing things, and the fact that we're here, it's no mistake that this country is one of the most powerful, countries in the world. And there's a shadow to how we got there, and that has come together, right? And it's really amazing that this country has amazing institutions and infrastructure that help us all be able to be in democracy and be safe and be able to communicate with each other, and that's really amazing. And that there's a way that we can lose our soul if we like keep on doing that, and you know what, we really can be the visionaries of the future. I really think it's super important to be able to have a progressive movement that is able to pick up the flag and say, you know what, let's go be positive leaders in this world. How can we be progressive leaders trying to build the future, without without rejecting the past, that got us here in the first place? That kind of leadership that sort of like honors everyone on the team is going to be exactly the kind of leadership that's going to help us move forward. And so personally, I'm committed to just continuing to not try to pick sides here, and be willing to sort of check my own shadows, be willing to listen to feedback, and be willing to trust that there's positive things that other people are saying, and then also that I am willing to admit my own flaws. And man, I got a lot of them, and probably you do too, and that's okay. But there's also really beautiful things here. And so if folks want more information on this, I've put a link on the side here, about an article about post-progressivism, which kind of breaks this down. And Steve McIntosh has made a series of videos, and I've had him on my podcast, Fractal Friends, a couple times. I've also put a link in the side there, of a whole series of episodes from Fractal Friends about transforming politics, and healing democracy. And, because as I always like to say, we all have a role to play in the whole. We're all in this together. And so hopefully we can lift up the best of each other. Thanks for watching this video, or for listening to this episode, and have a good day.